Well, as we come to the teaching of the Word today, I will like to just bring it specifically again before the Lord. Lord, as we come before you today, Lord, I pray that you have your hand on this message, Lord, that it would be your message, not ours. Lord, that you would take and use this, your word, for us to take and know you deeper. I pray these things in your name. Amen. So when I first heard that I was going to come back to Berean again, I was excited to take and come back and to see everyone again and to take and have a chance to preach the word again here. And then I realized what day it was. I'm like, oh, that's Mother's Day. And Mother's Day is a difficult time many times for a pastor and a preacher because we are celebrating mothers and we want to take and, oftentimes we want to take and say something specifically to mothers. But the problem is, does that mean that everyone else gets to just check out and, not listen that day because we're only talking to the mothers today? So that can be difficult to take and walk that line. So, however, as we look in 1 Samuel, and we look at the example of a mother in 1 Samuel, let's remember that these are principles that will transfer over, and hopefully you'll begin to see that as we continue to go on through the Word. I'm actually going to start elsewhere in the Bible and not my primary text because as I entitled this message, Signs of a Supermom, as many of you may have heard that terminology, because that's what's always being strived for in our culture today. And you find those women who are to be the perfect mothers, and the pressure is on everyone else to live up to that. And one of the difficulties why I said that, signs of a true supermom is everyone has a different definition of what supermom looks like. You have some who, you could be a supermom if you're going to take and make sure that you vaccinate all your children all on time, every single possible vaccination you could possibly have. And that's the definition of a supermom. You take and go to the next group, and in that group, you are the supermom if you take and don't vaccinate your children ever because vaccines are terrible. If you take and, are in one's group, you might have a group that says that the best way is you're going to take and feed them formula, right on time, on schedule, whenever they want it, to make them good and healthy, because that's great stuff. And then you take and go to the next group. You're a supermom if you've breastfed them until they're 5. And that's the definition of a supermom. So there's a great deal of confusion about what this really is. And I was thinking, I looked online, there's anywhere between 8 to 20 different signs or traits that make you a great or good mother. And I'm like, wow, this is terribly confusing. And partway through, I'm glad I'm not a mother to have to deal with all of this. But I was looking through it, and I came down actually really to one trait, and we're going to take and follow this trait through the life of Hannah. But if you would like to turn over, or you can just hear, to 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Because I identified one sign or one trait that I think truly exemplifies motherhood and how we should identify a supermom. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Let a man regard us in this manner, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. In this case, moreover, it was required of stewards that one be found trustworthy. Paul then goes on in that passage to take and say, it's a small thing for him to be judged by a human court for what he does. In fact, he says he doesn't even judge himself, but it's before the Lord that he is to take and be judged as his master. And if you think about it, motherhood is a great, great stewardship. Because great things are entrusted to us. If you look at the dictionary definition of motherhood, or of a mother, it says a woman who conceives, gives birth to, or raises and nurtures a child. You think of all of the things that are involved just in those statements. For those who conceive and give birth to, that's nearly a year of your life that is dedicated to this. And you have to be thinking about the child when you're pregnant. You can't take and just do what you want to do. You're stewarding that little life. Or you're taking and raising a child. You're nurturing a child. Maybe you're a foster parent or a step parent, and you didn't have to take and go through that portion. But still, to raise and nurture a child, especially in our culture, for 18 years or more, usually more in our current culture, because it never ends. This idea of stewardship and of having this great charge entrusted to us, and that's what I really think and would believe that motherhood and a mother is one who has this life and these things entrusted to us. And we're going to take a look at a woman who understood that and who understood some very important elements of that stewardship. And again, I said it's not going to be a time for everyone else to just take and check out from this sermon, because while not all of us have the stewardship of motherhood, all of us have been given stewardships by God in one way or another. I'll let one more thing out for just to take, ease the pressure for mothers and things like that, of all these different voices of what you're doing to take and steward this child, of what's best and how you're going to. There is only one person to whom you are accountable as a mother. And it's not your friends, it's not your enemies, it's not anyone here with all their varying different ideas of what a mother should be and how you should act as one. It's God. And God is the one that your stewardship is. So hard as it may be, you can ignore, to a degree, all of the other voices that take and say, well, that's not the right way to do it. And focus on the one. And that is the only voice that you have to take and deal with. And some of you are saying, well, that's not any great help, because, God, wow, if I screw up before that, that's even worse. But you have to remember, God is gracious and God understands and bears with our weaknesses. Sometimes people don't. Moving back to now 1 Samuel and the story and the example of Hannah, what we find there is a faithful steward. one who is faithful throughout the entire process, from before her actually becoming a mother, when we begin to see her in the first, through the end. And we see these elements of faithful stewardship. In the first portion of chapter 1, we see the story about a man, Elkanah, and his wives. Not wife, wives. He had 2 wives, which was not uncommon at this time period, but not something. Almost always when you had wives, you found more deeper problems because of them. And there are many things that the Bible records but does not endorse. One of the problems here that we see right off in verse 2 is he had 2 wives. One had children and one did not. Peninnah had children. Hannah did not. We're not sure, since children were so valued in this culture, he may have married Hannah first, and after a period of time of childlessness, married Peninnah later on in order to produce children. We've seen that in ancient times, and we don't know. We do know that he had 2 wives, one had children and one did not. The other thing that we know about this family is that they were religious. They did have a connection with the Lord. You have to remember this being the time of the judges, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But every year, it says, without fail, this man would go up to sacrifice to the Lord in Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle of the Lord was. Again, the temple in Jerusalem did not exist. And from Ramah to Shiloh was about a 10-mile journey every year to sacrifice. So, this was a family that understood the desires for worship and was being led by Elkanah in a good way that way. We do see that Elkanah had a favorite in Hannah. And it says that he would give portions to Peninnah and his wife and all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. And it happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, her rival would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? We see that Hannah was bitterly enduring the shame. She wanted children. She wanted children desperately. And she was grieved over that. But there's 2 things that are important to take and see in this. One, she doesn't lash out at Elkanah. At least she doesn't take and lash out. She realizes that God is dealing with her in some way, that this closing of her womb is from God, and she is enduring it year after year, faithfully. But it's interesting to see how much she desperately wants to have children. And this will especially come on later on. But she goes about it the right way. She takes and brings her entreaty to the Lord. We see in the next section, she has a faithful entreaty to the Lord. Verses 9 and following up to 18, you see that she comes before the Lord because she knows that only the Lord can take and help her. Only the Lord is the one who she can come before in her time of trouble. And she comes and entreats before the Lord, weeping bitterly. She said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come upon his head. She's seeing that, Lord, if you give me a child, this child is yours. In a sense, Hannah is making a vow, but she's also seeing that her child will not really be her own. She's making a vow about how she's going to go about that and devoting him to service. But I think she's also beginning to take and see this idea that this child is a gift from God and is ultimately God's, not her own. And so many times when we want something so badly, we want God to give it to us so that we can have it. We want God to give it to us so we can be happy. This so often happens that we want to get it for ourselves. She says, Lord, please remember me. Give me this child, and I'm going to give it back to you because it's yours. She understood that she was only going to receive a stewardship of this child. A stewardship before the Lord. Even when she's asking for it. And we see her faithfully entreating the Lord. I mean, how often do we take and go to this level when we take our hurting, when we take a need comfort, when we have a need, a desire? She is weeping and speaking in her heart before the Lord. So much so that Eli, the priest, thinks that she's drunk because she's not acting, just all calm and collected, but she's weeping and she's speaking before the Lord. But no sound is coming. And she's drunk. She says, "No, I am a woman of oppressed in spirit. I have speaking later out, but I have I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation." Many times when we come to give our entreaty to the Lord on things, we feel that we have to come in a calm way, just to take and yet this entreaty was anything but calm and collected. She was literally pouring out her heart before the Lord. You think of all the psalms, these prayers, these songs to the Lord. So many times the psalmist is crying out to God, "Why is this happening? Why are my enemies here? I'm oppressed. I'm running for my life. Lord, please save me." Sometimes we feel like it's not okay to deal with our pain, with our hurt, with all those emotions that well up when we deal with God. And yet God is the only one that can take and help us with those things. So again, she faithfully endured through years without taking and lashing out and becoming bitter towards the Lord or towards her husband. And she faithfully entreats the Lord. She comes to a spot where she pours her heart out to the Lord. Lord, give me stewardship of this child for a time, and I will bring him and give him back to you. So we move on down. Her wish is granted. Her prayer is granted. But it's interesting to note, before her wish, or her prayer, I should say, is granted, the first thing that it sees after this entreaty of her pouring out her heart, it says in verse 19, "Then they arose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord and returned again to their house in Ramah," or Ramah, I should say. She poured out her entreaty, and she receives the blessing of Eli the priest, but then she continues to go forth and worship the Lord. She's just poured her heart and soul out to the Lord of why don't you have, and yet still she comes and she worships Him. This is again why I think you can see her faithful endurance is that she did not become bitter to the point where she was unwilling to worship. That can be so hard when we're taking and waiting for something. And it says that in due time, after Hannah conceived, that she gave birth to a son and named him Samuel, because I asked of him of the Lord. Excuse me. And so she has a son. As she spoke. And what we see next is possibly the most amazing part of what Hannah does, is she follows through with her vow. That she really remembers that this child is not mine. This child is God's. Because at this point, she is promised no other children. She only has one. And you realize she'd probably been trying for years and years and years to have a child, and all of a sudden she has a child. But she remembers, this child's not mine. This child is God's. We could become so protective of what we're given by the Lord, of what we're given stewardship of, that we hold on to it so tightly. Remember the story of the man who had two calves, and he was going to take and have, one of them was the Lord's calf. He was going to take and sacrifice that one. And he takes and told his wife asked him, well, which one's the Lord's calf? And he said, well, I haven't really decided yet which is the Lord's calf. Whether it's this one or that one. And then next day, after the calves have become a little bit older and he still hasn't decided, he comes up bearing some sad news to his wife. He says, yes, the Lord's calf died. She says, I hadn't thought that you had taken and decided which was the Lord's calf and which wasn't the Lord's calf. He said, well, yeah, I just decided here just, how often we take and try to make a vow or a promise, and we take and we find a way to try and make a technical way to get out of it. But that's not the case here. And we see it's important both to Hannah and to her husband Elkanah, because they're going up to the yearly sacrifice. Elkanah is. This says, but Hannah did not go up with, and she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. And Elkanah, her husband, says to her, do what seems best to you, remain until you've weaned him, only may the Lord confirm his word. So in a sense, he's reminding her, okay, do what's best, do what needs to be done, but remember, God has said, the word and the vow is that he is the Lord's. It's almost as if he's saying, don't forget. But what we begin to see is she's taking her stewardship seriously. This idea of weaned is also that idea of being fully dealt with. Before a child was weaned, they could not be really entrusted to someone else's care. And so it's not merely nursing, but it's all of the different elements that go into training a child so that they can be somewhat independent of a mother's care. That, again, all these elements are necessary. So she's performing a necessary duty of stewardship. She is his mother. It's her duty to take and care for him until he is weaned, until he is able to be before the Lord. And this process would usually take anywhere from 2 to 3 years. So 2 to 3 years of work and labor to take and prepare him, knowing that she's not going to take and get to keep the fruits of her labor. If you think about that. Sometimes I know, especially for parents who don't like the toddler years, the baby years, they'll say, okay, let's just get through this time so that then we can enjoy them when they're older and they can talk with us and we'll have great fun with them once they become big kids. You know what? We don't know what Hannah's bent was, but if that was the case, then you can see she's there. She can't even look forward to having a time as a big kid with her son. She's going to wean him, do all this work, all this preparation. All of the training that goes on. Working with them. And then it's a true stewardship. She's gone. He's gone. He's going to be at Shiloh. And it's not just around the corner. It's 10 miles. She's not going to see him all the time. But she does all that execution of her vow, the execution of her stewardship. And in verse 24 it says, when she'd weaned him, she took him up with a sacrifice. And they brought the boy to Eli the priest, and she said, O my Lord, speaking to the priest, as your soul lives, I am the woman who stood beside you praying to the Lord. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to the Lord as long as he lives. He is dedicated to the Lord. And it says, and he worshipped the Lord there. she's fulfilling her vow. She's fulfilled her stewardship of dealing with the child. And she is passing on that stewardship. And the other thing that she does, that's amazing at this point still, with all of the pain of being separated, is that she is giving a song of exultation, of thanksgiving. Thanking God and praising God at this time. Think about it. If you had just had to take and leave your one and only son that you'd prayed for, that you'd poured out your soul for, and you'd take and said, God, or you'd had to leave him, who'd been a part of your life for 3 years because of a vow that you made to the Lord. That'd be very hard to take and not be, oh, God is taking so much. Why is he keeping me to this vow? Doesn't he know how much this is hurting me? But Hannah goes for 10 verses in a song of thanksgiving and exaltation to the Lord for his greatness and just who he is and his power. Because he has fulfilled everything to this point. And she fully has given her son to the Lord. It's the hardest thing about a stewardship. The hardest thing about parenting is that you don't get to keep them forever. There's a time when you have to let them go. When you have to give them over to the Lord and take and say, Lord, they're yours. However that might be. Can we still take and with Hannah praise the Lord for who he is in that time? You can see the stewardship that she has taken seriously through understanding that it's from the Lord, through being faithful to him, and through praising him for it. And I think it's not explicit in the text, but it appears that I think that she continued to take, as much as possible, even in those early years, to take and prepare Samuel for the life that he was going to take and have for the Lord, to teach him about the Lord, to show him that it was special what he was. Because of what we see, I know it's not, I was supposed to take and end at verse 11, but I just couldn't take and quite leave it right there. In verse 18 through 21, we see this family and Samuel again. And it says, Samuel was ministering before the Lord as a boy, wearing a linen ephod, and his mother would make him a little robe and bring it to him from year to year, when she would come up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, May the Lord give you children from this woman in the place of the one she dedicated to the Lord. And they went to their own home. And the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew up before the Lord. She would continue to encourage Samuel in worshiping and serving the Lord through his life, even after she had dedicated him, even after she was gone, to continue in that encouragement. She understood that her mission with Samuel before the Lord was to raise a young man to be ready to serve the Lord. As parents, as mothers, as stewards of the mysteries of God and His servants, what is our task? Our task is to take before the Lord to raise children, to know and worship and exalt the Lord, to show them the joy of that, to show them the awe of that. That's our one goal, or the one goal of this stewardship that we call motherhood and parenting, is to show them the joy of worshiping the Lord. And so the greatest moment in a child's life, and I should say in a mother's life, can be that time when you see that they do accept the Lord. And the joys when you see them beginning to walk and to keep on down that road. And that's as you continue to foster that faithfully the whole way through. But it doesn't always happen that way. You may be the best of encouraging them and nurturing them to follow the Lord, and they may choose not to. And that can be the greatest heartbreak for a parent. It's a stewardship to take and bring them before the Lord, to take and give them, as much as you are able, a joy and a knowledge of the Lord. But it's not a 1 + 1 + 1 = 3 proposition. Sometimes we think that it is. Sometimes we think we can, as parents, if a child doesn't turn out exactly the way that we would like, if they walk away from the Lord, we feel that somehow we have done something wrong. And that's not always the case. Sometimes, maybe there are things that you could do better, things that you regret. But remember, again, before their own master, the Lord, they will stand or fall. And your stewardship doesn't change. Your stewardship is the same. Even when they are breaking your heart with their decisions, with their actions, the stewardship is the same. To take and bring them before the Lord, to show them the joy of the Lord, and to be faithful in that. And we see that, for Hannah, we have a happy ending. For many others, they don't see that. But again, I believe that they will still be considered to be faithful before the Lord as they have been faithful. So the purpose of seeing how Hannah has worked through this faithfully, bringing Samuel before the Lord, is not to take a guilt trip on those whose kids are not perfectly before the Lord and say, you screwed up. It's not to lay extra pressure of, boy, if you're a mother, if your child, or a father, if your child doesn't take an work out exactly perfectly, then you've done something wrong. It's to take and show that you have a stewardship, and it is an awesome stewardship to be faithful in. One other place in the scriptures where this idea of faithfulness not necessarily equaling same results is in the book of Matthew. The book of Luke, chapter 16. Many of you may be familiar with this story and this parable that I wrote it down wrong. One second. In Luke chapter 19, the man has servants, a nobleman going to a distant country, and he gives them these different minas. He each gives them a mina. And some made 10 minas. And some make 5. And one just locks it away and doesn't use the... he takes and locks his mina away, and he doesn't take and use it for anything that his Lord intended. Is the one that only gives 5, or only produces 5, shamed for only producing 5? No. The Lord doesn't say, why didn't you produce 10? The one who is shamed is the one who took and didn't do anything with the money, who ignored the stewardship of that money that he was given. In the same way, when we have a stewardship, whether it be in parenting or whatever it might be, we are not condemned by the results. We are condemned by our faithfulness in what is required of us, or lack of faithfulness in what is required by us. So as we go forward, as we think about parenting and grandparenting and all of the different things that go before us, we need to remember that we are stewards of these precious lives before the Lord, and our stewardship is to bring the knowledge and the joy of worshiping the Lord before them. And to remember also to endure. Maybe sometimes it won't go well, but the same Lord who brought the stewardship on you is the same Lord who will be there to be with you in that pain. And sometimes the stewardship changes. The stewardship that Hannah had over Samuel changed. For the first 3 years, he was right there. She was, helping him to feed him, to clothe him, to wipe his runny noses. And that was one form of stewardship. Later on, she would come and encourage him every year and bring him a robe. And the stewardship changed what it looked like. But the ultimate stewardship never changed. And so sometimes our relationships with our children can change over time. Sometimes our relationships with all change over time in what they look like. But they don't change in their essence. We do need to turn the eyes of our children, the eyes of ourselves, to the Lord. I'm going to take and close in prayer. Then the worship team will come back up. And we'll take and sing one more song, and then we've got some closing announcements today. Lord, as we come before you today, Lord, there are so many ways that we are drawn and pulled, especially those who are mothers in our culture today, of what's important, of what's valuable, of what is required of them. Lord, I pray that you would take and clear our minds and clear our hearts to remember our stewardship from you. And Lord, that we would pray, Lord, I pray that you would take and come alongside each and every one who is bearing that burden. Lord, and help them to be, Lord, Lord, help them to be faithful. Lord, help them to bear up in the difficult times. And Lord, I pray that you would also bring others around them in the same way that you brought Elkanah around Hannah to help bear the burdens in this stewardship. Lord, that you might be glorified in all things. I pray these things in your name. Amen.